During the winter of 1885, the grand Fifth Avenue mansion of Elellanena Fairchild stood as a testament to one of New York's most disturbing tragedies. Behind its gleaming windows and limestone exterior lay secrets so deeply unsettling that the city's most powerful men would move heaven and earth to keep them buried. What started as a bereaved widow's effort to honor her late husband's memory would descend into a nightmare of conspiracy, murder, and madness that consumed not only Elellenena's sanity, but her life itself. The official records speak of suicide resulting from hysteria. But recently uncovered correspondence discovered hidden within the walls of a demolished Wall Street building tells a far darker tale. One that exposes how the financial elite of the Gilded Age constructed their fortunes upon carefully arranged deaths, and how they disposed of the one woman courageous enough to reveal their crimes. Before we go further into the story of Elellanena Fairchild and the devastating secrets that brought about her ruin, take a moment to subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments what state or city you're listening from. We love connecting with our community of mystery lovers from all around the world. The truth behind what happened to Elellanena Fairchild begins not with her death, but with the mysterious events surrounding her husband's final evening on Earth. New York City in 1885 sat at the very peak of America's Gilded Age, a dazzling metropolis where extraordinary wealth flowed through the marble corridors of Wall Street while immigrants were packed into tenements just streets away. The city's financial district hummed with the energy of a rising industrial empire, where railroad barons, steel magnates, and banking dynasties accumulated fortunes that would have made European royalty envious. Along Fifth Avenue, palatial mansions climbed skyward like monuments to this new American aristocracy, their owners throwing lavish dinner parties and charity galas that dictated the social order of the entire nation. Among these titans of industry stood Theodore Fairchild, a man whose financial brilliance had made him one of the most feared and respected figures on Wall Street. At 45, Theodore commanded a vast network of investments stretching across railroads, mining operations, and manufacturing concerns. His extraordinary ability to anticipate market movements had earned him the nickname the Oracle of Exchange Place. Business rivals whispered that Theodore possessed an almost supernatural talent for knowing precisely when to buy or sell, frequently reaping massive profits from the misfortunes of those around him. Eleanor Catherine Brennan had wed Theodore in 1878, transforming overnight from the daughter of a modest Boston merchant into one of New York's most prominent socialites. At 25, she carried the refined beauty and sharp intelligence that made her the perfect complement to Theodore's ambitions. Elellanena had not married simply for wealth. She genuinely adored her husband and deeply admired his brilliant mind. She embraced the role of society hostess with extraordinary skill, organizing charity events that raised thousands for the city's orphanages and hosting intimate dinner gatherings where the most powerful men in America conducted their affairs over fine wine and imported cigars. The Fairchild Mansion at 847 Fifth Avenue perfectly reflected their standing. Constructed in the fashionable French Second Empire style, the four-story limestone palace featured soaring ceilings, hand-carved marble staircases, and rooms adorned with European antiques and original paintings. The crown jewel of the estate was Theodore's private study, a wood-paneled sanctuary lined with leather-bound books and housing a massive safe where he stored his most sensitive business documents. Eleanor had always honored her husband's need for privacy in his business affairs, appreciating that the world of high finance demanded absolute discretion. Their marriage, though initially arranged through family connections, had blossomed into a genuine partnership. Theodore frequently sought Elellenena's counsel on social matters, recognizing her remarkable ability to read people and situations. She in turn had developed a sophisticated grasp of business and finance through their conversations, though she was careful never to exceed the boundaries of what society considered fitting for a woman of her position. They had no children, a quiet sorrow for Elellanena, but Theodore's dedication to his work and her commitment to their social obligations had filled their lives with purpose and meaning. The New York of 1885 was a city of striking contradictions. While the privileged dined on 7-course meals in gilded chambers, newspaper headlines regularly reported on financial panics that left thousands of working families destitute. The recent completion of the Brooklyn Bridge had come to symbolize American ingenuity and progress. Yet labor strikes and industrial accidents claimed lives with disturbing regularity. In this climate, men like Theodore Fairchild wielded enormous influence, their decisions capable of affecting the livelihoods of thousands of workers and the fortunes of entire cities. What Elellanena had not yet grasped was that her husband's extraordinary success had come at a price far more terrible than she could have imagined. The evening of November 17, 1885, began much like countless others in the Fairchild household. Elellanena had spent the afternoon preparing for one of their customary business dinners, ensuring every detail met Theodore's exacting expectations. The dining room gleamed with polished silver and crystal, while the kitchen staff prepared a menu of roasted duck, imported oysters, and charlotte russe, Theodore's favorite dessert. These gatherings were far more than mere social occasions. They were carefully staged meetings where some of New York's most influential financiers conducted their most sensitive business. That evening's guests included Harrison Kensington, a silver-haired banker who controlled much of the city's railroad financing, Marcus Cromwell, a sharp-featured man whose shipping empire dominated the East Coast ports, and James Wainwright, the youngest of the group at 38, whose family's textile mills had made him enormously prosperous. Elellanena had hosted these three men on dozens of occasions and had come to recognize the subtle dynamics that existed between them. Theodore clearly held the position of authority, while the others deferred to his judgment with an almost military precision. As the evening wore on, Elellanena sensed an unusual tension hanging in the air. The men's conversation, ordinarily animated with talk of market opportunities and political developments, carried an undercurrent of anxiety she hadn't observed before. During the soup course, she caught fragments of hushed exchanges. Mentions of the Pittsburgh situation and references to someone described as the problem that needed to be resolved permanently. When she attempted to enter the conversation with a light remark about recent social gossip, the table fell into a silence that made her cheeks burn with embarrassment. Theodore, usually so attentive to her comfort, appeared distracted and unusually pale. She noticed that his hands trembled slightly as he reached for his wine glass, and beads of perspiration dotted his forehead despite the cool November evening. When she quietly asked whether he was feeling well, he assured her it was merely the strain of a particularly complex business negotiation, but his eyes held a haunted quality she had never witnessed before. The dinner progressed through its courses with mounting awkwardness. The men's voices fell to barely audible murmurs whenever sensitive subjects arose, and Eleanor found herself shut out from conversations that had previously welcomed her observations about social and political affairs. She began to feel like an unwelcome stranger in her own dining room, a sensation that both puzzled and pained her deeply. It was during the serving of the charlotte russe that everything changed. Theodore had just raised his spoon to his lips when he suddenly gasped, his face contorting in agony. The silver spoon clattered onto his plate as he clutched his chest, his breathing turning rapid and shallow. Elellanena rushed to his side, but before she could reach him, Theodore collapsed forward onto the table, sending crystal glasses crashing to the floor and staining the white tablecloth with dark red wine that looked disturbingly like blood. Theodore! Elellenena's scream rang through the mansion as she dropped to her knees beside her husband's chair. His eyes were wide with terror, and his lips moved as though he were trying to speak, but only a terrible gasping sound escaped him. Harrison Kensington immediately assumed control, dispatching Marcus Cromwell to fetch the family physician while ordering the servants to clear the room. Elellanena found herself gently but firmly guided away from Theodore's body by James Wainwright, who assured her that Dr. Henley would know precisely what to do. Dr. Purcell Henley arrived within 20 minutes, his medical bag in hand and his expression grave with professional concern. Elellanena watched from the doorway as he examined Theodore's motionless form, checking for vital signs with the practiced efficiency of a man accustomed to attending such emergencies among the city's elite. After what felt like an eternity, Dr. Henley straightened and shook his head solemnly. "I'm afraid Mr. Fairchild has passed away," he announced in a voice that carried both sympathy and authority. "Given his recent complaints of chest pains and the evident stress of his business obligations, I believe we are looking at a fatal heart attack. Such tragedies are unfortunately common among men of his age and responsibilities." Elellanina's world crumbled in that moment. The man who had been her partner, her protector, and her greatest love was gone, taken without warning or the chance for a final farewell. Through her tears, she was dimly aware of the other men speaking in hushed tones with Dr. Henley, making arrangements for the body and discussing the necessary legal formalities. Their efficiency in managing the crisis seemed almost indecent in its swiftness, but Elellanena was too overwhelmed by grief to question their actions. What she failed to notice in her devastation was the brief exchange of loaded glances between the three surviving dinner guests, or how Dr. Henley gave a subtle nod when Harrison Kensington whispered something into his ear. She didn't observe how Marcus Cromwell quietly removed Theodore's wine glass and dinner plate, or how James Wainwright made a subtle gesture that caused the butler to clear the entire table with unusual urgency. In the days that followed, as Elellanena struggled to make sense of her new reality as a widow, the official account of Theodore's sudden death solidified around her. The newspapers reported that one of Wall Street's most brilliant minds had succumbed to the pressures of high finance, a cautionary tale about the dangers of pushing oneself too hard in the pursuit of success. Friends and business associates offered their condolences while praising Theodore's remarkable career and lamenting the loss of such a gifted financier. But Elellanena could not shake the memory of her husband's terrified eyes in those final moments, or the peculiar behavior of his dinner companions. Something about that evening felt fundamentally wrong, though she could not yet put into words what had disturbed her so deeply. The weeks following Theodore's funeral passed in a haze of condolence visits and legal consultations. Elellanena found herself navigating an entirely unfamiliar world of financial documents, business partnerships, and legal obligations that had previously been her husband's exclusive domain. Theodore's attorney, the distinguished Cornelius Dalton, guided her through the complexities of the estate with paternal kindness, explaining that Theodore's vast holdings were now hers to manage, or as he delicately put it, to entrust to more experienced hands. The Fairchild financial empire proved considerably more extensive than Eleanor had realized. Beyond the obvious railroad investments and mining interests, Theodore had maintained a complicated web of holdings that encompassed everything from shipping companies to manufacturing concerns, newspaper interests to banking partnerships. The paperwork seemed never-ending. Stock certificates, bond holdings, partnership agreements, and correspondence with business associates across the continent. Each document demanded Eleanor's signature. Each decision required her immediate attention. What struck Eleanor as peculiar was the remarkable precision of Theodore's investments. Time and again, she found that her husband had made brilliant financial moves just days or weeks ahead of major market developments. He had divested from railroad stocks just before a devastating train accident destroyed an entire line's reputation. He had purchased mining claims shortly before rival operations suffered mysterious cave-ins or equipment failures that wiped out their competitive advantage. He had invested heavily in shipping companies immediately before their competitors suffered a series of catastrophic accidents that eliminated them from lucrative trade routes. At first, Elellanena credited these coincidences to Theodore's exceptional business instincts. The men she had married possessed a near-supernatural ability to read market trends and anticipate industrial developments. But as she delved more deeply into his records, patterns began to surface that troubled her increasingly analytical mind. The timing wasn't simply fortunate. It was impossibly precise, as though Theodore had possessed advanced knowledge of the disasters that befell his competitors. Among Theodore's personal papers, Eleanor discovered a locked drawer in his study that neither she nor the household staff had ever seen opened. When the locksmith finally managed to unseal it, Elellanena found herself staring at documents that challenged everything she believed she knew about her husband's business methods. The drawer held detailed newspaper clippings about industrial accidents, train derailments, and the sudden deaths of rival businessmen, each one carefully dated and annotated in Theodore's precise handwriting. More disturbing still were the coded telegrams and cryptic correspondence with men whose names Eleanor didn't recognize. Letters signed with initials rather than full names, discussing solutions to problematic situations and referring to permanent resolutions of business conflicts. The language was deliberately vague, but the implications sent chills racing down Elellanina's spine. These were not the communications of legitimate business negotiations. They read more like the planning documents of a criminal enterprise. One letter in particular, dated just 3 weeks before Theodore's death, seized Elellenena's attention. Written on expensive paper without a letterhead, it was signed simply HK and discussed the Pittsburgh problem that Elellanena remembered overhearing at that fatal dinner. The letter spoke of the need for decisive action and assured Theodore that our associate has been contacted and fully understands the urgency of the situation. It concluded with a cryptic reference to a substantial payment arranged for services rendered. Elellenena's hands trembled as she held this correspondence. Harrison Kensington shared those exact initials, and she clearly remembered his presence at numerous business dinners where similarly coded conversations had taken place. Could the distinguished banker who had offered her comfort in her darkest hour actually be involved in something sinister? The idea seemed impossible, yet the evidence before her eyes suggested connections she could not ignore. Her investigation took on an increasingly obsessive quality as winter settled deep into the harsh New York January of 1886. Elellanena spent hours in Theodore's study, poring over documents and attempting to decipher the true meaning behind his business correspondence. She began constructing timelines linking Theodore's investment decisions with the disasters that subsequently befell his competitors. The patterns that emerged painted a portrait of systematic market manipulation through what could only be described as deliberately orchestrated catastrophe. The more Elellanena uncovered, the more isolated she became from her former social circle. Friends who had once competed eagerly for invitations to her dinner parties now seemed uneasy in her company, their conversations growing stilted and artificial whenever she tried to raise the subject of Theodore's business affairs. At charity events and social gatherings, Elellanena noticed how quickly conversations died when she drew near, and how people's eyes seemed to avoid hers entirely. Dr. Henley, who had pronounced Theodore dead, began making increasingly frequent social calls to check on Eleanor's emotional well-being. His visits, though ostensibly motivated by professional concern for a grieving widow, carried undercurrents that made Elellanena profoundly uncomfortable. He would ask probing questions about how she was spending her time, whether she was dwelling too heavily on the past, and whether she had been experiencing any nervous symptoms that might warrant medical attention. Whenever Elellanena mentioned her interest in understanding Theodore's business affairs, Dr. Henley's expression would darken with what he framed as concern for her delicate constitution. Most troubling of all was Elellenena's growing awareness that she was being watched. Servants she didn't recognize began appearing on Fifth Avenue at odd hours, their eyes seemingly tracking her movements whenever she stepped outside the mansion. Letters she was certain she had left in particular places within Theodore's study would appear in slightly different positions, as though someone had been examining them during her absence. The sensation of being under constant surveillance grew so overwhelming that Elellanena began to question her own perceptions, wondering whether grief was driving her toward paranoia. As winter gave way to spring, Eleanor's investigation had unearthed enough disturbing evidence to persuade her that Theodore's death had been no natural heart attack, and that his business success had been achieved through means that violated every moral principle she held sacred. But the depth of the conspiracy she was uncovering, and the power of the men who appeared to be involved, made her understand that her own life might now be in danger. The question that haunted her sleepless nights was no longer simply what had Theodore done, but who was watching her now, and what they might be prepared to do to protect their secrets. Spring of 1886 arrived with renewed determination as Elellanena resolved to move beyond passive investigation and take decisive steps to uncover the truth about her husband's dealings. Her transformation from grieving widow to resolute investigator had been gradual but profound, driven by the mounting evidence that Theodore's death was bound up in something far more sinister than ordinary business rivalry. Eleanor's first breakthrough arrived through an unexpected source. Margaret O'Brien, the Irish cook who had served the Fairchild household for nearly 6 years. Margaret had always been more perceptive than the other servants, and her loyalty to Elellanena had deepened considerably during the difficult months following Theodore's death. One morning in April, as Elellanena reviewed financial documents in the breakfast room, Margaret approached with obvious nervousness. "Begging your pardon, Mrs. Fairchild," Margaret began in her soft Dublin accent. But there's something I've been needing to tell you about the night Mr. Theodore passed. God rest his soul. Margaret's weathered hands wrung at her apron as she continued. I was in the kitchen when Dr. Henley left that evening, and I saw him talking with Mr. Kensington by the garden gate. They didn't realize I was watching from the pantry window, but I heard Mr. Kensington say something that's been troubling me fierce. Elellanena set down her papers and gave Margaret her undivided attention. The cook had proven herself reliable over the years, and her observations frequently carried insights that others missed. Mr. Kensington said clear as day, the dose was perfect. No one will ever suspect. And then Dr. Henley replied, just remember our agreement about the widow. She must never learn what we know. They shook hands like they were sealing some kind of pact, ma'am, and it's been eating away at me ever since. The implications of Margaret's revelation hit Elellanena like a physical blow. If the cook's account was accurate, then Theodore had indeed been murdered, and Dr. Henley had been complicit in both the killing and the subsequent cover-up. The dose could only be a reference to poison, administered with such precision that it perfectly mimicked the symptoms of a heart attack. Elellanina's grief transformed into cold fury as she recognized that the men she had trusted to comfort her in her most vulnerable moments had in fact been her husband's killers. Armed with this new intelligence, Elellanena began examining Theodore's death from an entirely different angle. She recalled how Dr. Henley had arrived with suspicious speed that evening, almost as though he had been anticipating the emergency call. She remembered the practiced efficiency with which the dinner guests had managed the crisis, their seamless coordination suggesting prior experience with exactly such situations. Most tellingly, she now understood why Theodore's companions had been so visibly anxious throughout the meal. They had been waiting for their plan to take effect. Eleanor's investigation intensified as she worked to understand the full scope of the conspiracy. She began making discreet inquiries about the men who had been present at that fateful dinner, gathering details about their business practices that formed an increasingly disturbing picture. Harrison Kensington, she discovered, had been party to at least a dozen railroad investments that had profited handsomely from the mysterious failures of competing lines. Marcus Cromwell's shipping empire had grown through the systematic acquisition of rival companies that had suffered inexplicable runs of misfortune, fires, accidents, and equipment failures that had driven them into bankruptcy. James Wainwright's textile operations had similarly benefited from competitors' misfortunes, and Elellanena began to notice that all three men shared certain unmistakable characteristics. Their businesses consistently thrived in the aftermath of their rivals' disasters. Their success coincided with a remarkable pattern of accidental deaths among competing businessmen. And their social circles overlapped in ways that suggested careful coordination rather than coincidence. The pattern that emerged was one of systematic market manipulation through violence. These men were not simply successful businessmen. They were running what could only be described as a murder-for-profit operation, eliminating competition through meticulously planned assassinations disguised as accidents, suicides, or natural causes. Theodore had clearly been a central figure in this scheme, his analytical mind perfectly suited to identifying targets and timing attacks for maximum financial benefit. Elellanina's discovery of this network explained Theodore's uncanny gift for anticipating market movements. He hadn't been predicting them at all. He had been engineering them through violence. Every brilliant investment, every perfectly timed stock purchase, every fortunate coincidence had been built upon someone else's death. The fortune that had given Elellanena her luxurious lifestyle, her social standing, and her comfortable security had been purchased in blood. As Elellanina's understanding of the conspiracy deepened, so too did her sense of personal peril. She began to observe that her social isolation was growing more pronounced and more deliberate. Invitations to prominent social events ceased arriving. Longtime friends began declining her dinner invitations with transparent excuses, and business associates who had once competed for her attention now appeared uncomfortable even acknowledging her on the street. More ominously, Elellanena realized that her own movements were being monitored with increasing intensity. Letters vanished from her study, only to reappear in slightly different positions. Servants she didn't recognize appeared in her household, recommended by employment agencies connected to Harrison Kensington's office. Her personal correspondence was clearly being intercepted, as she noticed that responses to her letters frequently addressed concerns she had never explicitly raised. The psychological pressure was beginning to affect Eleanor's daily life in ways she could no longer dismiss. She found herself flinching at sudden sounds, checking locks repeatedly before retiring for the night, and living with a persistent feeling of being watched even within the privacy of her own home. Sleep became elusive as she lay awake listening to every creak and groan of the old mansion, wondering whether tonight would be the night they decided she had learned too much. Dr. Henley's visits increased in frequency, his medical examinations growing more intrusive and his questions more pointed. He began suggesting that Elellenena's nervous condition might require more aggressive intervention, perhaps even a period of rest at a private sanitarium where she could receive the specialized care that her fragile mental state demanded. The threat implicit in these suggestions was unmistakable. Comply with their wishes, or face involuntary commitment to an institution where her credibility would be permanently destroyed. Eleanor understood that she was racing against time. The conspirators were clearly preparing to silence her, either through confinement to an asylum or through more permanent means. Her only hope lay in assembling enough evidence to expose their crimes before they could eliminate her as a threat. But every passing day brought fresh dangers, and Elellanena could feel the net drawing tighter around her with terrifying inevitability. The woman who had once presided over elegant dinner parties for New York's elite now found herself living in unrelenting fear, her own home transformed into a prison where she was both captive and quarry. The cat-and-mouse game had begun in earnest, and Eleanor was keenly aware that she was playing for her very life. By the summer of 1886, Elellenena's investigation had uncovered evidence that stretched far beyond the three men she had initially suspected. The conspiracy reached into the highest tiers of New York society, encompassing judges, police officials, newspaper editors, and even members of the city's Board of Health. What she had stumbled upon was not merely a business arrangement between a handful of wealthy men, but a vast criminal network that had been operating with near total impunity for at least a decade. Elellenena's most damning discovery arrived in the form of a leather-bound ledger concealed behind a false panel in Theodore's office safe. The ledger, written entirely in Theodore's careful hand, contained detailed records of what could only be described as assassination contracts. Each entry included the target's name, the justification for their elimination, usually described as market impediment or competitive interference, the method to be employed, the payment schedule, and the date of completion. The entries were chilling in their methodical precision. A railroad executive named Thomas Crawford had been resolved through a carriage accident on October 15, 1883, generating profitable stock acquisitions worth $180,000. A shipping magnate called Robert Sinclair had been addressed via apparent suicide on March 22, 1884, enabling the acquisition of 3 profitable trade routes. A textile manufacturer named William Hayes had been concluded through a factory fire that claimed his life along with 17 workers, generating insurance payouts and business opportunities worth over $200,000. Most horrifying of all was the revelation that the conspiracy maintained a network of professional killers operating throughout the Northeast. These men, referred to in the ledger only by number rather than name, each specialized in different methods of elimination. Agent 7 handled accidents involving carriages and horses. Agent 12 arranged industrial mishaps and building fires. Agent 23 had perfected the art of administering poisons that left no detectable trace. The ledger revealed that Theodore had served as the network's primary strategist, identifying targets whose deaths would create maximum market disruption and profit potential. His role had been to analyze business competitors, assess their vulnerabilities, and determine the most financially advantageous timing for their removal. The other conspirators had managed the practical arrangements. Kensington oversaw the financial operations and money laundering. Cromwell coordinated the logistics of the killings themselves. And Wainwright maintained the web of corrupt officials who ensured that investigations never progressed beyond superficial inquiries. Elellenena's blood ran cold as she reached the final entries in the ledger. The last completed contract, dated November 10, 1885, just 1 week before Theodore's death, involved the elimination of a Pittsburgh steel manufacturer whose factories competed directly with Wayright's operations. But it was the final incomplete entry that sent Elellanina's hands into a trembling she could not control. E.F. Widow. Excessive curiosity. Permanent resolution required. To be arranged. The initials were unmistakably her own. Elellanena Fairchild had become the conspiracy's next target. Eleanor's discovery of her own assassination order propelled her into immediate action, though it also filled her with a paralyzing dread. She now understood that every day she remained in New York brought her one step closer to a carefully engineered death. The conspirators had already been laying the groundwork for her elimination through Dr. Henley's repeated insinuations about her mental fragility. Her death would most likely be attributed to suicide brought on by prolonged grief and nervous exhaustion, a tragic but unsurprising end for a widow who had never recovered from her husband's sudden passing. The psychological warfare intensified sharply once Elellanena grasped that she had been marked for death. Strange accidents began occurring with alarming frequency. A chandelier in the dining room crashed to the floor just minutes after she had been standing beneath it. A gas valve in her bedroom was found to be leaking, thankfully caught by Margaret's sharp nose before Elellanena retired for the night. And her carriage suffered a mysterious wheel failure while traveling down Fifth Avenue that could easily have resulted in serious injury or death. Each incident was crafted to look accidental, but the timing and frequency made it unmistakably clear that these were deliberate attempts on her life. Elellanena understood that the conspirators were experimenting with different methods, perhaps determining which would appear most natural and attract the fewest questions. The psychological toll was devastating. Elellanena found herself unable to trust anything in her environment, from the food she consumed to the stairs she climbed. Dr. Henley's visits became progressively more aggressive in their medical evaluations. He began bringing a colleague, Dr. Reginald Steinberg, who specialized in nervous disorders and institutional commitment procedures. Together, they subjected Elellanena to prolonged examinations that centered on her mental state rather than her physical health. Their questions grew more invasive and accusatory. Did she believe people were plotting against her? Had she been experiencing paranoid delusions regarding her late husband's business associates? Was she having difficulty separating reality from imagination? Elellanena recognized that the doctors were constructing a medical case for her involuntary commitment to an asylum. Once institutionalized, she would be entirely powerless to expose the conspiracy, and her eventual death could be attributed to the worsening of her mental condition. The prospect of being confined in one of the era's notorious private sanitariums, subjected to the primitive and frequently brutal treatments inflicted on hysterical women, filled Elellanena with a terror that surpassed even her fear of death. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror of Elellanina's situation reaches a new level. If this story is sending chills down your spine, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss stories like this one. Let's find out together what happens next in Eleanor's desperate fight to survive. Eleanor's desperation drove her toward a decision that would either save her life or accelerate her destruction. She would attempt to gather irrefutable proof of the conspiracy and bring it before authorities who stood outside the network's reach. Her plan was bold and fraught with risk. She would document everything she had uncovered, produce multiple copies of the evidence, and simultaneously present her findings to federal authorities, major newspapers, and law enforcement officials in other cities. Working in complete secrecy, Elellanena spent her nights photographing pages from Theodore's ledger with a small camera purchased discreetly. She composed detailed written accounts of everything she had learned, including Margaret's testimony about the exchange between Dr. Henley and Kensington. She assembled lists of suspicious deaths that corresponded to the conspiracy's profitable investments, building a timeline that laid bare the systematic nature of the murder scheme. Eleanor's plan required her to maintain every outward appearance of normality while secretly preparing her evidence. She continued attending social functions, submitted to Dr. Henley's examinations, and kept up the facade of a grieving widow slowly succumbing to nervous exhaustion. But beneath this performance, she was readying herself for what she knew would be her one and only chance to reveal the truth and preserve her own life. The stakes could not have been greater. Elellanena was engaged in a desperate contest against opponents who had already shown their willingness to kill without hesitation. Her window of opportunity was narrowing rapidly as the conspirators moved toward their final strike against her. The evidence she had gathered would either vindicate her accusations and bring down one of the most powerful criminal networks in American history, or it would perish with her, ensuring that their secrets remained interred forever. As summer gave way to autumn, Elellanena could sense the tension approaching its breaking point. The coming days would determine whether justice would finally be served, or whether she would become yet another entry in Theodore's ledger of perfectly executed murders. The first week of October 1886 brought unseasonably warm weather to New York City, but Elellanena felt nothing but icy dread as she prepared to set her desperate plan in motion. She had arranged to meet 3 separate contacts on the same day. A federal prosecutor who handled interstate commerce crimes. The editor of the Herald Tribune, a newspaper untouched by the conspirators' influence. And a police detective from Philadelphia with no ties to New York's corrupt system. Elellenena's strategy was straightforward but perilous. Present her evidence simultaneously to multiple authorities, making it impossible for the conspiracy to suppress every investigation at once. She had assembled 4 complete sets of documentation, including photographs of Theodore's assassination ledger, copies of the coded correspondence, Margaret's written testimony, and her own detailed analysis tying the murders to specific financial gains. 3 sets would go to her contacts, while the 4th would be secured in a safety deposit box at a bank beyond the conspirators' reach. On the morning of October 8th, Eleanor rose early and dressed with particular deliberateness, understanding that this could be her final day of freedom, or her last day alive. She had arranged to meet the federal prosecutor at 10 o'clock in the morning, the newspaper editor at 2 in the afternoon, and the Philadelphia detective at 5 in the evening. Each appointment was scheduled at a different location to minimize the chance of the conspirators tracking her movements and preventing all 3 encounters. Eleanor's first indication that her plan had been discovered came as she was preparing to leave for her morning appointment. Margaret approached with obvious distress, reporting that 2 unfamiliar men had positioned themselves at the street corners near the mansion, and that Dr. Henley had arrived without warning, claiming he needed to conduct an urgent medical examination. "He's in the front parlor, ma'am, and he's brought that other doctor along again," Margaret whispered urgently. "He says you're having a medical emergency and that he needs to see you straight away." "But ma'am, you look perfectly well to me, and his manner is most peculiar. He seems agitated and keeps glancing at his pocket watch." Eleanor's heart hammered as she realized that the conspirators had somehow discovered her plans and were mobilizing to prevent them. Dr. Henley's presence, combined with the suspicious men positioned outside, suggested they intended to have her committed on the spot, blocking her from keeping any of her appointments. Once under their medical authority, they could ensure that her evidence never reached the proper hands. Eleanor made a snap decision that would seal her fate. Rather than confront Dr. Henley head-on, she instructed Margaret to inform him that she was feeling faint and would need a few moments to compose herself before the examination. Using the servant stairs, Elellanena swiftly gathered her prepared evidence packets and slipped out through the mansion's rear entrance, which opened into a narrow alley connecting to 48th Street. Elellenena's flight through the streets of Manhattan became a desperate race against time and those pursuing her. She could see men following her as she made her way toward the federal building, their presence confirming that the conspiracy had deployed considerable resources to stop her. Elellenena's plan began to unravel as she realized that her pursuers seemed to know her destinations in advance, suggesting they had somehow learned the details of her scheduled appointments. The federal prosecutor's office delivered the first crushing blow to Elellenena's hopes. When she arrived at the building, breathless and terrified, she was told that Prosecutor Williams had been called away on an emergency and would not be available for their scheduled meeting. The clerk's explanation sounded rehearsed, and Elellanena noticed that he kept his eyes averted as he delivered the news. She left the evidence packet regardless, insisting it be placed in Williams's hands upon his return, though she had little confidence it would ever reach him. Eleanor's afternoon appointment with the newspaper editor proved even more disastrous. When she arrived at the Herald Tribune offices, she was informed that editor Morrison had fallen suddenly ill and had been hospitalized that very morning. The timing was far too convenient to be coincidence, and Elellanena understood that the conspiracy's reach extended even further than she had imagined. They had somehow identified her contacts and neutralized them before she could present her evidence. Desperation pushed Eleanor to attempt her final appointment with the Philadelphia detective, even as she feared it would prove equally futile. Detective Patrick Kelly had agreed to meet her at Grand Central Station, planning to return to Philadelphia on the evening train after reviewing what she had brought. Eleanor arrived early, hoping that the public nature of the location might offer some degree of protection from her pursuers. Detective Kelly proved to be both Eleanor's last hope and her final disappointment. When she approached him at their agreed meeting point near the main departure board, his expression conveyed barely concealed hostility rather than the professional interest she had anticipated. His opening words confirmed her worst fears. "Mrs. Fairchild, I've been contacted by some very concerned parties regarding your condition. Dr. Henley has explained your situation to me at length." Elellanina's blood turned to ice as she realized the conspiracy had reached even this distant contact. Detective Kelly had been compromised, most likely through a combination of bribes and carefully crafted lies about her mental state. The evidence packet she had intended to hand him would never see daylight, and her last avenue toward justice had been sealed shut before she even had the chance to use it. "Detective Kelly, please hear me out," Eleanor pleaded, her voice carrying the desperation of a woman who knew her time was nearly gone. "The evidence I have will prove that my husband and his associates have been murdering people for profit. There is a ledger that documents dozens of assassinations, and I can prove that Theodore was poisoned at our own dinner table." Kelly's response was measured but firm, the tone one might use with a disturbed patient. "Ma'am, Dr. Henley has explained about your delusions. You have been under tremendous strain since your husband's passing, and it has affected your ability to think clearly. The best thing you can do now is come with me peacefully. Dr. Henley is waiting just outside with an ambulance to take you to a private facility where you can receive the care you need." Elellanena saw with perfect clarity that she had been completely outmaneuvered. The conspirators had anticipated her every move, neutralizing her contacts and arranging a final trap that would remove her from society for good. The private facility Kelly mentioned would serve as her prison and, in time, her grave, a place where her death could be written off as the natural progression of her deteriorating mental health. In that moment of absolute despair, Elellanena made one final, desperate choice. She would not be led quietly to her destruction. If she was going to die, she would at least attempt to create a public spectacle that might draw some attention to her plight. With sudden force, she broke free from Detective Kelly and ran toward the crowded main concourse of the station, screaming about murder and conspiracy with every bit of strength she had. "They killed my husband. Harrison Kensington and Marcus Cromwell are murderers. They have been killing people for money." Elellanina's voice rang through the vast hall as dozens of travelers turned to stare at the elegantly dressed woman who appeared to be in the grip of a complete mental collapse. "Dr. Henley poisoned Theodore. They are trying to kill me to keep me silent." The scene that unfolded was precisely what the conspirators had engineered. Elellanina's public breakdown, witnessed by scores of respectable citizens, provided flawless confirmation of her mental instability. Dr. Henley materialized as if summoned, accompanied by two orderlies in white coats who moved toward Eleanor with the practiced calm of men well accustomed to handling distressed patients. "Please, everyone, stand back," Dr. Henley announced to the gathering crowd, his voice radiating professional authority and deep compassion. "This poor woman has been suffering from acute nervous exhaustion since her husband's death. We are here to help her, but she has been experiencing paranoid delusions that cause her to believe people intend to harm her." Elellanena fought against the orderlies who restrained her, continuing to shout her accusations, which sounded increasingly unhinged to those watching. The more frantically she tried to explain the conspiracy, the more her words seemed to confirm every word of Dr. Henley's assessment. The very details she was trying to communicate, the scope of the murder network, the involvement of respected businessmen, the systematic nature of the killings, sounded like the elaborate fantasies of a mind that had completely lost its grip on reality. As the orderlies carried Elellanena toward the waiting ambulance, she caught sight of Harrison Kensington observing from the shadows near the station's entrance. His expression was one of composed satisfaction, the look of a man whose carefully laid plans had reached their intended conclusion. Elellanena understood in that instant that everything, her isolation, the staged accidents, the medical examinations, even this final public scene, had all been orchestrated to achieve exactly this outcome. The last thing Eleanor saw as the ambulance doors closed was Detective Kelly shaking hands with Dr. Henley and accepting what appeared to be an envelope thick with cash. Her final hope of justice dissolved as she recognized that even her supposedly independent contact had been purchased by the very men she had set out to expose. Elellanena Catherine Fairchild was committed to the Westchester Private Sanitarium on October 8, 1886, under the medical authority of Dr. Purcell Henley and Dr. Reginald Steinberg. The facility, situated in a remote section of Westchester County, specialized in caring for wealthy patients suffering from nervous disorders and mental ailments that might prove an embarrassment to their families. It was precisely the kind of discreet establishment where inconvenient individuals could vanish without attracting unwanted scrutiny. The sanitarium's records, fastidiously maintained by the staff, documented Elellanina's rapid deterioration from the moment of her arrival. According to Dr. Henley's initial assessment, the patient suffered from acute paranoid hysteria brought on by prolonged grief and nervous exhaustion. Her claims about murder conspiracies were classified as elaborate delusions, typical of the hysterical female mind under extreme duress. Eleanor's treatment followed the standard protocols of the era for managing difficult female patients. She was confined to a private room, denied visitors outside of immediate family, of which she had none, and subjected to a regimen of cold water treatments, prolonged bed rest, and gradually escalating doses of medicinal opiates intended to subdue her agitated mental state. Her requests to contact authorities or send correspondence were refused on medical grounds, with Dr. Henley explaining that such activities would only reinforce her dangerous delusions. Margaret O'Brien made several attempts to visit Elellanena during the first weeks of her confinement, but was turned away each time with explanations that the patient was too unstable to receive visitors. The loyal cook's persistence eventually earned her a meeting with Dr. Henley himself, who patiently explained that Elellanina's condition was deteriorating rapidly and that outside contact risked triggering violent episodes that could endanger both Elellanena and the staff. What Margaret did not know was that her own time was running short. On November 15, 1886, exactly 1 month after Elellanina's commitment, Margaret O'Brien was found dead in her small apartment near the Fairchild mansion. The police report attributed her death to a gas leak from a faulty stove, a tragic accident that had claimed the life of a hard-working immigrant woman who had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. The timing ensured that the only witness to the exchange between Dr. Henley and Harrison Kensington would never be able to offer testimony about what she had overheard. Eleanor's own end came with the grim inevitability the conspirators had planned from the very beginning. On December 3, 1886, after nearly 2 months of institutional confinement and increasing doses of laudanum, Elellanena was found dead in her room at the Westchester Sanitarium. Dr. Henley's official report attributed her death to cardiac failure brought on by the progressive deterioration of her nervous system and the toxic effects of prolonged mental anguish. The death certificate, signed by Dr. Henley and countersigned by Dr. Steinberg, made no mention of the massive dose of morphine that had in fact stopped Elellanina's heart. The drug had been administered during what the medical records described as a therapeutic treatment for severe agitation, but what had actually been a calculated execution carried out under the cover of medical care. Elellanina's funeral was a modest affair, attended primarily by former servants and a handful of social acquaintances who felt duty-bound to pay their respects. Harrison Kensington, Marcus Cromwell, and James Wainwright all attended, playing their parts as concerned friends who had tried without success to help a troubled widow overcome her tragic descent into madness. Their expressions of condolence were masterful performances, projecting precisely the right measure of sadness and quiet relief that Elellanina's suffering had at last come to an end. The New York Times ran a brief obituary that framed Elellanena as a cautionary tale about the perils of unrestrained grief. The piece described how the sudden loss of her beloved husband had triggered a mental collapse that led to progressively more bizarre delusions about business conspiracies and assassination plots. The obituary praised Dr. Henley's tireless efforts to treat Elellanina's condition, while acknowledging that some forms of female hysteria proved resistant to even the most advanced medical interventions. Eleanor's estate was swiftly settled by Cornelius Dalton, who had been appointed executor of her will. The Fairchild fortune, valued at over $2 million, was distributed according to Theodore's prior instructions in ways that greatly benefited his former business partners. Harrison Kensington's bank received substantial deposits. Marcus Cromwell acquired several profitable shipping investments at below-market prices. And James Wainwright gained control of textile operations that complemented his existing empire. The mansion at 847 Fifth Avenue was sold to a railroad magnate from Chicago, and all of Theodore's business records were carefully destroyed during the settlement process. Cornelius Dalton explained that the documents contained sensitive financial information capable of damaging the reputations of various business associates if they were ever made public. The destruction was carried out under Harrison Kensington's direct supervision, ensuring that no trace remained of the assassination ledger or the coded correspondence that had first revealed the conspiracy's existence. With Elellanina's death, the murder-for-profit network pressed on with renewed confidence. The elimination of both Theodore Fairchild and his widow had demonstrated the organization's capacity to manage internal threats while sustaining their public images as respectable men of business. Over the years that followed, the conspiracy extended its reach, eventually spreading its influence throughout the Northeast and into the industrial heartland of the Midwest. Dr. Purcell Henley's reputation was burnished by his handling of the Fairchild case, and he became a sought-after specialist in treating the nervous conditions of wealthy women. His private practice flourished, and he developed a particular expertise in cases where female patients exhibited paranoid tendencies requiring institutional intervention. The doctor's success rate in curing such ailments was remarkable, though his patients displayed an unusually high mortality rate that he attributed to the severity of their underlying conditions. The Westchester Private Sanitarium continued operating for another 15 years, serving as a discreet repository for inconvenient individuals whose continued presence had grown problematic for powerful interests. The facility's records were destroyed in a convenient fire in 1902, ensuring that no evidence remained of the suspicious deaths that had occurred within its walls. By the early 1900s, most of the original members of the murder conspiracy had died of natural causes, carrying their secrets to graves marked with elaborate monuments celebrating their contributions to American business and civic life. Harrison Kensington was remembered as a philanthropist who had donated millions toward the construction of hospitals and schools. Marcus Cromwell's shipping empire became a cornerstone of American international trade. James Wainwright's textile operations provided employment for thousands of workers and helped lay the industrial foundation of the modern economy. Their true legacy endured, however, in the criminal networks they had built, which continued to function long after their deaths. The methods they had pioneered, the systematic removal of business competition through violence, the corruption of medical and legal authorities, the weaponization of mental health institutions against inconvenient witnesses, became templates that criminal organizations would replicate for generations to come. Elellanena Fairchild's story faded into the archives of forgotten tragedies. Remembered only as a footnote in the occasional academic study of women's mental health during the Gilded Age. Her name appeared in no history books. Her warnings went unheeded. And her evidence was lost to time. The courageous woman who had sacrificed everything to expose one of America's most dangerous criminal networks became just another entry in the era's epidemic of female hysteria and nervous collapse. This story shows us how power and wealth can corrupt even the most fundamental institutions of justice and medicine, bending them into weapons against the innocent. The tale of Elellanena Fairchild reminds us that throughout history, Those who have dared to expose the crimes of the powerful have often paid the ultimate price for their courage. Her tragedy stands as a sobering reminder that the most terrifying monsters are not supernatural creatures, but ordinary men who have persuaded themselves that their wealth and position place them beyond the laws that govern everyone else. What do you think of this story? Do you believe that such conspiracies could have flourished in the shadows of America's Gilded Age? Share your thoughts in the comments below and let us know your feelings about Eleanor's tragic fate. If you enjoyed this tale of historical darkness and want more unsettling mysteries from America's past, subscribe to our channel, hit the notification bell, and share this video with someone who loves uncovering the sinister secrets that history tried so hard to bury. Until next time, remember that the most frightening stories are often the ones that could actually be true.